In this series of videos, I'm going to be overhauling the bottom end of my 2017 KTM 250 EXC. The bike has done 456 hours, still runs great, but I decided it's a good interval to do some preventative maintenance and overhaul the bottom end, including changing out all the bearings and also putting a new conrod in the crankshaft. You'll be able to follow step by step. I'll share any information regarding special tools and also tips and tricks. This is part 2, in which I disassemble the engine. In part 1, I removed the engine from the frame. If you're not sure how to do that, be sure to check it out. As you can see here, I've mounted my engine on an engine stand. This particular one's made by Motorsport, which I purchased from the US. This is really handy because you can easily access all parts of the engine and rotate the engine on the stand. So by flipping this lever, you can move it round and put it any angle you like. Really handy to have. It's not cheap, but it's not that expensive, so recommend it if you have the budget to purchase one. Now I've removed the engine, I've gone over it thoroughly with parts cleaner and a cloth and removed all the dirt and debris. And it's also a very good idea to have a copy of the repair manual to reference while you're working on the engine. I'm kind of old school. I like having a printed out version on paper and put it in a ring folder, and then it stays flat and organized, and you can follow instructions, look up information very easily and quickly while you're working on the engine. When disassembling the engine, I like to use trays like this to organize parts. It makes it a lot easier on assembly than having all the parts mixed together. Okay, so the disassembly sequence I'm going to follow is what's recommended in the KTM repair manual, and the first step is to remove the shift lever. Next is to remove the clutch push rod, so this just slides out. Next is to remove the countershaft seal spacer, which is located here. This comes out pretty easily. You can use 2 screwdrivers like this and just prise it out. Next is to remove the countershaft O-ring, which is located in here, and to do that I'm going to use this pick tool which has a hook on it. I'm not going to be reusing the O-ring or seal, not particularly bothered whether I damage it, and it just removes like that. The next step is to remove the stator cover, and for covers and cases that have different length bolts, I always make a simple template like this. When I take the bolts out, I can put them into the hole, and reassembly is very easy and ensures that I don't put the wrong length bolt in the wrong hole. And when removing large covers like this, it's a good idea to use a crisscross pattern to ensure the cover doesn't warp. And I've removed all the screws now, and you can see there's a longer screw here and here, and all the others are the same length. So in this position and this position, use longer screws. Next I'm going to remove the stator cover. Before I do that, I'm going to cut this zip tie, and then I can lift off the cover and remove it. And this is what the stator cover looks like inside. The stator looks like it's in good condition. This winding is covered in some material. It's black, it's not burnt out, no problem at all. This particular cover is a XRC billet machined cover. Super tough, super strong. I really like these. It also has the XRC bronze bushing in, which allows the Bendix to function correctly, and these basically never need replacing. They don't wear out. They do require lubrication from time to time, but very reliable, makes your starter system super reliable. Next I'm going to remove this cylinder head, and it's recommended to use a crisscross pattern when loosening them like this. And the RK TEK Head has an insert inside, so I've hand threaded in a spark plug so I can pull the insert off with the head outer, and simply lifts off. And that's what it looks like inside. And I'm going to use a pick tool to remove the O-rings. Be careful not to damage the cylinder when you're doing this. Next, I'm going to remove the power valve covers both sides, and the screws are Torx 25. Be sure to use the correct bit or you may damage them. And then the cover just lifts off. And I've turned the engine round, and I'm going to remove the right hand side power valve cover next. This is Torx 25 as well. Very important to use the right size bit. If you use a bit which is too small, initially it can fit in, but it can slip and then damage the heads. So be sure to use the right size. And then I can remove the cover. And on the bottom it's held on with a rubber gasket, so you have to slide it off. Okay, next I'm going to remove the power valve linkage retainer, which holds the linkage onto the ball. It's quite easy to drop the clip down into the engine, so it's a good idea to use a cloth. You can just run one through and cover up the hole when you remove it. And I use a screwdriver just to get the end of the clip and flip it round. And as you saw there, it sprung out, so it is quite easy to drop, and then it just slides down. And that's what the clip looks like. So it slides up into a hole underneath the linkage and then swivels around. And then you can gently pry off the linkage from the ball. And then you can remove the gaskets. The next step is to remove the cylinder stud nuts, and there's 4 of them. There's 1 each side in the power valve cover inside, and 2 at the rear. And I recommend loosening these in a crisscross pattern like this. To remove the stud nuts inside the power valve cover, there's very little clearance between the nut and the power valve mechanism. So you won't be able to use a socket, but for loosening you can use a ring spanner like this. For installation, you want to be able to torque them. So I have these torque adapters, 13 millimeters, which I actually sell on the Tokyo Off-Road web shop, and this allows you to put the ring onto the nut and then use a torque wrench to torque to spec. Really handy. And to allow enough clearance to get your ring spanner onto the nut, you can lift the power valve mechanism up, store your ring spanner, and then loosen. And I'm going to take the last nut off, and then I can remove the cylinder and carefully raise it, and I'm going to hold the conrod in place so it doesn't flop around. And here you can see what the cylinder looks like. I haven't cleaned it out at all, so it's exactly as it came off, so it's still got some oil in there, but I don't see any major damage at all. There's some light marks. This cylinder has done 150 hours, so looks like it's no problem at all. Next I'm going to remove the piston, and I put a cloth down in the crankcase to stop the circlip falling down. And on this side I've used Easy Clip. You can see the ears here. Very easy to install and remove just with pliers. And when I installed this, I put the ears at the top and they haven't moved at all, so that's good to see it doesn't move. And I'm going to take it out now. And I've turned the engine round, and I'm going to remove the wrist pin next. So it still has the circlip installed on this side of the piston. And I'm going to use the Tokyo Off-Road piston pin removal tool to gently tap out the wrist pin from the piston. It's important to support the piston with your hand and tap gently so no lateral force is applied to the conrod, or you can damage the big end bearing and the conrod. A little bit more. And that should be enough, so I can remove the tool and lift off the piston. And this is what the piston looks like. It's had about 150 hours on it. It's in really good condition, very little wear. You can still see the horizontal machine marks on it. They haven't worn away at all. No heavy scores at all. Some very light marks which you can't feel. This is the intake side, and the exhaust side is similar. No heavy wear at all. Probably the most wear is just this area here, which has become slightly polished. Everywhere else looks in really good shape. No heavy scores or marks. You can see some blow-by in this area and in this area as well. So from my rating, I think 150 hour period is a good interval for changing the piston. I'm pretty happy with that. And this is what the crown of the piston looks like. Some very light carbon deposits. In these areas there's no carbon. Happy with that, don't see any problems at all. And here you can see the wrist pin. There's some discoloration indicating some heat, but I can't feel any wear marks, so no serious issues there. Even though I've already decided to replace the conrod and all the bearings in the bottom end, I thought it'd be interesting to do an inspection and some quick checks to determine what condition the crankshaft is in before replacing it after 456 hours. The first thing to do is to inspect the conrod, and you're looking for scoring in this area where it could rub up against the crankshells. And I don't see any marks, I don't see any discoloration, so that's good. The next thing to check is vertical play on the conrod, and you're checking any play in the big end bearing and also the crankshaft bearings. So the method is to pull the conrod right up and then vertically push down and pull up. And you have to be careful not to rock the conrod from side to side. And I don't feel any play at all. So that indicates that the big end bearings and also the crankshaft bearings are still in good shape. Then you can push the conrod down and apply a lateral force and rock the conrod sideways, and you want to check the clearance between the crankshaft shells. And if it can touch either of the crankshaft shells, it indicates that the big end bearing is quite worn and certainly needs to be replaced. So those quick checks and inspections show the bottom end is still in good condition, and I haven't noticed any issues while riding, so I could probably go on longer using it. I've already decided to overhaul it though, and I do like doing preventative maintenance when it's convenient for me rather than waiting for something to break. But if you're trying to push out the service interval on the bottom end as long as possible, I think you could safely go longer than this. And I did make a video during my last overhaul of the top end regarding some bottom end measurements you can make to judge the condition of the bottom end. And one of them was a lateral rock of the conrod to measure the condition of the big end bearing using a dull gauge. So if you're interested in seeing that, I'll put a link to that video in the description of this one. And I'm going to go ahead and remove the base gasket. And next I'm going to go ahead and remove the water pump cover. It's just held on with these 4 screws. And I made this simple template for the water pump cover screws because I know they're different lengths. The drain one is very long, so that's easy to remember, but maybe not so easy for the other ones, which are quite similar in length, but different. So yeah, the 2 front screws are the same length. The ones at the back are different. The one on the bottom is longer than the top one. So a good idea to use a template. And then you can take the cover off. Another handy feature of this engine stand is it has a drip tray in the base, which is removable. So while you're disassembling things, even if it drips coolant or oil, you can catch that in the drip tray, remove it and drain it. Very handy. Next, I'll remove the power valve spring tension adjuster. It's just held on with 2 screws. And next I'm going to remove the large clutch cover, which is this piece. You can leave the small clutch cover in place if you like. And because there's lots of screws, total of 11 screws, I made this template to keep track of all the different ones and where they go. And I'm going to be using a crisscross pattern because there's lots of them. You don't really need to follow a specific order, but just relieve the tension on the case kind of evenly around it. So I've removed all of the clutch cover screws, and it looks like there's 3 different lengths. And now I'm ready to remove the clutch cover, and you have to get it over the linkage, so kind of pull it off a little bit and keep the Kickstarter mechanism in place, and then you can lift it off. Okay, so now you can see I've laid the engine over on its side using the stand, and I'm going to remove the clutch cover gasket carefully. I'm not going to reuse this obviously, but there are some dowels, so you need to keep track of those and make sure you don't lose them. So this one's come out with the gasket, so I need to be careful I don't lose that one. And there's another dowel around the back, and one here as well. And then I'm going to lift it off and remove this dowel so I don't lose it. And I'm going to go ahead and remove the other dowels. They come out pretty easily. I don't want them dropping out and then losing them later. Next I'm going to remove the power valve linkage, which is held on with these 2 screws. And once they're fully loosened, you can just lift it off. And next I'm going to remove the clutch and clutch basket. I have a whole video covering this, so I'm not going to spend much time explaining it. I'll provide a link to that video in the description of this one if you're interested in that. And it's a good idea to use a crisscross pattern to loosen the Belleville spring tension bolts. And then you can lift off the tension adjuster and the Belleville spring. And then you can remove the pressure plate. And this has got a steel plate stuck to it. And I'm going to be putting a new clutch in, so I don't really care that much, but it's a very good idea, especially if you're going to be reusing the clutch plates, to keep them in the order they came off. Because there's different thickness steel plates used. If you check the video I made regarding overhauling the DDS clutch, I have full details in that. I'm going to remove hopefully the majority of the clutch plates. Slide off. And it looks like there's just one steel plate left, so I'm using my pick tools to remove that. And you should note that there's 6 dowels as well. One of them fell out while I was taking the clutch pack out, so be careful you don't lose any of those. The next step is I want to loosen the primary gear nut, which is here, and to do that you need to hold it in place. So I have the KTM tool, and Motion Pro also make a similar tool which works fine. I used that in a previous video, and I'm going to be using a 27-inch socket on a long 1/2-inch drive breaker bar, And I should note I've clamped the engine stand down to the bench so it can't move, because this is quite high torque, and I don't want to have to be supporting everything while I loosen it. And it loosens relatively easy with a long breaker bar. But as I say, it's reverse thread, so don't try going the normal way or you have big problems. And you can go ahead and remove the lock washer as well. Next, I'm going to remove the clutch basket, which is held in place with this nut, and the nut is held in place with a lock washer. So you need to bend down the tabs of the lock washer first. And I use a screwdriver which is suitable for hammering. You can see it's got the hard end, and lightly hammer it down, just so there's enough room to get a screwdriver in there to bend it. Then once you have a gap, you can lever it down carefully with the screwdriver. And you should never reuse these lock washers. And to undo the nut, you need to hold the clutch basket in place. And the tool I like using for that is one I made myself from some old clutch plates. And you just use the clutch dowels to hold the tool in position. You can use a two-finger clutch tool as well, carefully, but you need to make sure it doesn't slip and damage the clutch basket. Okay, so I have my clutch basket holder tool installed with all 6 dowels, and I'm using a 1/2-inch drive 27mm socket with a 1/2-inch drive breaker bar. You can use impact if you like, but I'm just going to use this breaker bar and socket. And it's quite tricky. The reason being that the Loctite used is a high strength one. So the initial force required to break the Loctite is quite high. But it is possible with a long breaker bar. Then when you remove the clutch holder tool, make sure you don't lose any of the dowels. Then you can remove the inner hub. And note that there's a washer which is stuck there. Be sure not to lose that. And then you can remove the basket. And then you can remove the needle bearing and the collar. And next I'm going to remove the Kickstarter shaft. So you remove the spring. It's just held in light tension. And then you can remove the shaft. Next I'm going to remove the Kickstarter idler gear. And I have a video regarding a mod for this. If you have a 2017, be sure to check that out. So the mod is using a longer bolt than stock, which goes further down into this part of the case, which supports the idler gear better. With the stock bolt, it's very short, and this boss can break off if you kickstart a lot. So definitely a good idea to do the mod, and hopefully it will last much longer. And I should note that bikes after the 17 model, so 18, 19, and later bikes, including TPIs, they have a modified case design which addresses this issue. So I haven't heard any failures on bikes after 2017. And next I'm going to remove the shift shaft located here. So the method is to slide this that way and then pull up. I'm just using a pick tool to slide the shift shaft up, and it comes out like that. And there's also a washer down here which you need to remove. Next I'm going to remove the shift drum, and you need to remove the screw which holds it down, and it's a hex 5mm bit you require for that. So it just unscrews, and you can remove the screw, and pushing away the tensioner you can remove the shift drum. Then you can go ahead and remove the shift drum tensioner arm. You just remove this bolt, and then the lever just removes the spring. And next I'm going to be removing the rotor or flywheel, and I've just noticed I've left the gasket on, so I'm going to go ahead and take that off. And I'm also going to remove the dowels. So there's 2 dowels that just come out easily. It's a good idea to take them out just in case they drop out while you're working on the engine and you lose them. So next you need to remove the flywheel nut, and you need to hold the flywheel in place. And I have this KTM special tool which works really well. It has a geared section which engages on the outer part of the flywheel, and these 2 prongs engage in the case here to hold it still. So it just slips over, and you have to get it onto the teeth, and it holds it in place. You can use a flywheel holder tool if you don't want to purchase the special tool. All the KTM special tools I'm showing, I'll put the part number in the description of the video. And I'm using a 70mm socket on a 3/8 drive breaker bar. And take the nut off and the lock washer. Then I can remove the tool, and next I need to pull the flywheel off. And I'm going to be using a Motion Pro flywheel puller. The size is M26 by 1.0 right hand thread. So I'm going to apply a little bit of grease to the end of the crankshaft, and then install the tool. So you want to unscrew the tool to start with, screw it onto your flywheel, so on fully, and then you can tighten this down and it will pull off the flywheel. It's quite tight. Oh, and there it goes. And just lifts off. And next I'm going to remove the crankshaft position sensor, which is here. It's just held in with 2 screws. And now I'm going to remove the Bendix. This just lifts out. Okay, next I'm going to remove the starter motor, which is here. And the first step is to remove the cover, which is held on with the bolts here. It's very difficult to get access to the bolts. I'm going to be using a Torx 30-bit because I couldn't fit an 8mm socket on it. And I should note that I'm going to be replacing the starter motor. This is the original starter motor, so I've used it for over 450 hours. But because they're quite difficult to replace, you basically have to lift the engine up out of the frame to be able to remove it. I thought it's a good interval period to go ahead and replace the starter motor. Okay, then next you want to remove these 2 screws. And you should note that just by removing these bolts, you still won't be able to remove the starter motor. It's held in with a collar from the other side. So I'll need to flip the engine over and remove that collar. And both of these bolts are the same length. And then you want to pull the starter motor out as far as it'll go, which is about there. And I flipped the engine over, and this is the collar that you need to remove, and it's held in place with this screw. So I'm going to remove that next. And to remove the collar, I'm going to be using this special KTM tool. It's listed as pliers for footrest spring, and it has jaws which are specially shaped, which can fit round the collar. And that's the collar out, that's what it looks like. And then you can go ahead and remove the starter motor. And that's what the starter motor looks like. And there's an O-ring in here, which I'm going to go ahead and remove, and I'll use a new one when I replace the starter motor. So next I'm going to go ahead and remove the reed valve, and it's just held on with 4 screws. And this is a Moto Tassiniri V-Force 4 reed valve. I think it's a lot better than the stock reed valve. I made a video when I first got the bike, and I compared the stock reed valve to the Moto Tassiniri one. If you're interested in that, have a look for that. I'll put a link in the description. I have a funny story about the stock reed valve that came on my bike. They're meant to have a total of 4 reed petals, and mine had 5. In one place it had 2 reed petals stuck together and installed. So that gives you an idea of the quality control on those stock reed valves. And then the reed valve just simply removes, and you can remove the gasket as well. This gasket is one I made myself. And the only remaining parts I have left to remove are the primary gear and the balancer mechanism. So there's a gear here, a shaft and a counterbalance, the other side of the engine. Interestingly, the removal of the balancer mechanism is omitted from the 2017 repair manual. So I referenced a later version, and it's detailed in there. And simply use the KTM special tool. And I'm going to use it like this. In the manual it actually states to use it like that. I think this way is a little more secure and less likely to slip. So engage that, and then you can loosen the screw on the balancer gear. And it's reasonably easy to do. And now I can remove the primary gear. Mine is a little tight. I couldn't pull it off by hand, so I'm using this simple gear puller. And it comes off really easily using that. So that's what that looks like, and came off easily. And next I can remove the balancer gear. And that slides off very easily. And to remove the shaft, I need to remove the woodruff key, and I tried using some pliers, it wouldn't come out easily. So I'm going to use a punch very carefully and some very light hammering just to get it loose a bit. And you can see it's come out now. So it's a half moon shape woodruff key. It's a little bit tricky to get out, but with some patience, and if you're very careful, you won't damage anything. And then from the other side, you can just slide the balancer shaft out. The next step is to remove the case screws, and there's 14 of them all around the case. I've made this simple template to keep track of all of them, and I'm going to be loosening them in a crisscross pattern initially. So I have all of the bolts out now. There's a total of 14, and there's 4 long ones and 10 shorter ones. Okay, so now I'm removing the nuts on the engine stand, getting ready to split the cases. And you can see here the special spacers I made to hold the engine well on the threaded rods. So 2 different sizes. This has worked really well, pleased with it. Okay, so now the engine is just resting on the engine stand, it's not held down with the bolts. And I'm going to use a dead blow hammer, which is a rubber material, to try and loosen up the 2 halves a little. So be careful when doing this. And to separate the 2 crankcase halves, I'm using this crankcase separator tool, and I've positioned the arms evenly as I can, and they have these adapters which I've screwed in, and I'm applying a little bit of pressure, and you can see I've put the crankshaft nut on, and I've greased that as well, so the tool isn't pressing directly on the crankshaft. And now I'm ready to apply some more tension and start pulling the 2 halves apart. And it's separated nicely now. And you want to make sure it goes up evenly. So this end is a little bit stuck, so I'm just going to do some gentle hammering. There we go. And that's completely loose now, so I can take the tool off. Okay, so now I can lift off the case. Okay, so now I'm going to start disassembling the transmission. So the first step is to pull out the fork selector shafts. So there's 2 of those, one here and one here. And then move the forks to the side so you can remove the drum. And next you can remove the shift forks. And I want to remove the transmission shafts, but there's a lock ring on this side of the engine. So I've turned the engine around, and I'm going to use some circlip pliers to remove the lock ring. And that's what that looks like. Okay, so now I'm ready to remove the transmission, and you need to pull both shafts at the same time, and you might have to jiggle a little bit, but they'll come out. And you can see that came out quite easily. And the final step of the disassembly is to remove the crankshaft. So this just simply lifts out. So that's the end of the disassembly of the engine. In the next part, part 3, I'll be rebuilding the crankshaft. So please look out for that if you're interested.